welcome everyone to this new series of the European Chamber. We decided to use the month of July in order to introduce you to 7 authors, 7 new books that just came out or about to come out. And I'm very happy that these authors all basically agreed upon. This is like a birthday party. As you know, the European Chamber just turned 20. And it's a wonderful thing that we can have this kind of sessions. We had a VIP session with lots of politicians in May. This is our thoughtful month, so to speak. And I'm very happy also to have moderators such as Charlene Barshevsky and Martin Wolf and Joschka Fischer, the former German foreign minister and vice chancellor, sort of being the people that are being the moderators. Now, today's moderator is a special person, despite the fact that she's still struggling with a microphone. It's Alex Stevenson. She's based in Hong Kong, and she is with the New York Times. She was based for a while in Beijing and now is back in Hong Kong. And as a matter of fact, in the next days, she is expecting a baby. So we have to hold our breath. And then, of course, my old friend Michael Schumann, he's the one who authored this wonderful book, Superpower Interrupted. I guess all of you struggle to get a hard copy, but you know, you can buy the Kindle version. So that's the thing you have to do after this session. Of course, Chamber doesn't have any commission, so we do this out of our goodwill. So I don't know if Alex now can hear me and talk. No, she can hear me, but she can't talk. Anyhow, maybe I just start, and Alex, once you are able to say something, not physically, but technically, then just chip in and yell and scream. I just start with Michael. I mean, Alex has been laboring 35 months to have a baby. How long did you work on your book?
And it's funny you say that, Jörg, because I've actually compared, of course, I've never had a baby, but I've compared books to having a baby. And I think you feel about a book like you kind of feel about a child after it comes out. But I spent about 3.5 years, 4 years on this book in total. It was a lot of research, a lot of reading through Chinese texts.
Yeah, Alex, are you there? No. Still not. Yeah, I mean, are you proud of your baby? I mean, you had the misfortune of publishing this book basically before COVID.
Yeah.
And is that then an ugly baby for you? Or are you still proud and you think it's still sort of worth introducing it to your chamber members?
Well, I mean, the book actually is a history that goes all the way back to beginnings of kind of Chinese civilization, and it's not a current affairs book. I mean, you know, the part about the modern period, the book is actually supposed to be structured like Chinese history. So the modern period is actually kind of condensed all the way at the far end, which is where it should be if you're looking at the full scope of all of, you know, of the history of Chinese civilization. And the idea of it was to look at world events through a Chinese perspective. And the idea came to me because I was thinking about how people learn history. And I don't know what history is like in Germany, but when I went to school in New Jersey in the United States, in high school, I went to actually just a regular public high school, a pretty good high school. But my choices of history were American history and American history. And other parts of the world kind of factor in, obviously, to American history, but only within the American narrative. They kind of make cameo appearances. And I started thinking that that's how kind of we in kind of Western civilization, what we call Western Civ, when you study Western Civ in college, that's how we learn history. And it goes back to, you know, Greece and Rome and the spread of Christianity and the rise of Europe and the Age of Discovery and, you know, the Reformation, and then America and the kind of the offshoots of European civilization. And then, yeah, you learn about other parts of the world, but they kind of all factor in, they all fit into that narrative. And this started me thinking that other parts of the world do the same thing. They have their own narratives. So there's such a thing as a Chinese history of the world, where the Chinese kind of tell their narrative, and other things and other events that are really important to us in Europe and the United States really don't, mean a whole lot to people in China or Japan or India or elsewhere. And then if you know this story, if you know how the Chinese kind of tell their own history and how the Chinese see themselves in the greater world through that history, then you can better understand what China is about today and where China may be going. So that's how the idea started. And there's challenges to it, because you get into, well, first of all, what is China? Because, China in the old Han Dynasty was not China as we understand it today as a nation state. So that's one problem. I solved that by basically following China's own historiography, the way that Chinese historians over the years have kind of followed the narrative of their own history. The much harder one was what is a view of history, because history is constantly reinterpreted and reinterpreted again and rewritten and reinterpreted some more. And honestly, I didn't want to write a Communist Party view of the world, which would be kind of seeing things through the modern prism of kind of China, I guess Chinese at least official society. So the way I did this is that I actually went back to and looked at what Chinese were writing about themselves and the world, going all the way back to some of the earliest writings that we have on China, basically going back to the classics, the Confucian classics, and looking at everything from poems to letters to official dynastic histories, to imperial memorials, whatever, going back 2,500 years, and looking at how the Chinese wrote about themselves and how they saw themselves versus other people, and how they understood China's role within the world. So you got something like not a real-time look at how the Chinese understood themselves, because you're sometimes looking at large gaps between the events and the sources, but at least whatever, as close as I could get to it. So from there, you develop this concept that the Chinese have a certain worldview that is an outgrowth of their own historical experience, in the same way that we in Europe and the US have a certain worldview and certain values and certain ideas about what our role is in the world. The Chinese have their own view of this about their role in the world. And that's very much around in Chinese foreign policy and China's view of the world today.
Can you unmute yourself, Alex? It shows that you are muted. No. Oh boy. No. Alex, I think you might have to possibly write your questions into the box and send it to me, and I read them out. I'm sorry.
You know what? She might be able to read, to basically log out and log back in, and you guys may be able to unmute her actually too, Jörg.
Well, as you're both in Hong Kong, maybe she just crosses the street and joins you, huh?
Actually, we're not that far away from each other, but you as the organizer, you may be able to unmute her if she's muted.
Well, I'll leave that to the staff. Because we have so many people online, we cannot just throw them out. Let's start with your book.
Okay.
You start off with saying the biggest question of the 21st century is, what does China want?
Right.
And then you allude to the fact that actually they want to be the comeback kid. I mean, they used to be the dominating economic and political force, globally as well as politically, at least regionally.
Right.
So is that really what they want? Because I mean, the messages you get from Beijing is actually they really actually wanted to be richer and more safe and all of the above. Or is there really something we don't catch?
Well, yeah. I mean, when you ask the question, "What does China want?" and this is something that policymakers in the U.S. and Europe have kind of agonized about, right? I mean, for a while, for much of the last, let's say, 40 years, the idea was that China wanted to be kind of more like us, right? A more open, wealthier society that was going to kind of play a larger role within the world that Europe and the United States created. Now that totally shifted in the last 3 or 4 years, and now we think that China is basically kind of an authoritarian adversary, and we're heading towards some kind of Cold War. When you look at Chinese history, you can kind of see things differently, and you start realizing that what China wants is something what they always had, or what they think they always had. When you look back at Chinese history, I mean, they weren't always every single century a dominant political and military power. But they were for large stretches of time. And on the economic side, as you said, China has traditionally been one of the world's largest economies and a major engine of world trade going all the way back 2,000 years. And I think even more importantly, and something that I think is forgotten, China was a tremendous soft power. The real foundation of Chinese power was the allure of its civilization. Even when China was weakened politically and it was invaded, or it was civil war and things, there were no unified government. The influence of Chinese civilization remained incredibly strong, and you see that. I mean, when you look at East Asia, what is East Asia? Why do we separate East Asia as a region from the rest of the world? To a great degree, it's because it's a Chinese cultural zone. And the other societies use Chinese characters, and historically they based their education system on China's. They read Chinese books. They adopted Chinese artistic styles. So China was a major political, economic, and cultural force in the world for much of its history. And then on top of that, you get into Chinese political ideology. Well, what effect did that have on Chinese view of themselves and their role in the world? And then you get into the ideas that the Chinese actually believe that they deserve to be a great power, that it's somehow that they're right. As a great civilization, they have the right to be a great power. In their political philosophy, a lot of people already know this. The emperor was not just some kind of ordinary run-of-the-mill ruler, but was the son of heaven. Was this indispensable link between the divine and man, who brought order to the universe. So if you have someone like that, as your sovereign of your country, well, how can that person be on an equal plane to all these other chieftains and kingdoms of all these other places? Well, obviously you can't. So in Chinese political thinking, China was, the world was a hierarchy, and China was on top of the hierarchy, and everybody else was basically in a subordinate position. That's where you get into this idea that you had China and you had Chinese vassals in the kind of Chinese political thinking. That's not how things actually worked in real life, but that was the language that was used. So here we are now in the 21st century. Well, actually, one more thing. What's amazing about Chinese history, when you look back on it, is how often the Chinese were able to restore their power. As I said, they weren't always a great political and military power, but when they did go through rough patches, or they were invaded by the Mongols, they had a period after the fall of the Han Dynasty where there was no unified empire for 350 years. So they've gone through some pretty rough times, but eventually the political elite put the pieces back together, rebuilt the pillars of power, and recreated again and again and again, turned China into a superpower. So look at what's happening today. You could basically put what's happening right now in this historical context, that after a couple of hundred years when China was in a weakened position, that you have another Chinese government that's rebuilding itself into a superpower. And the thinking, and you can see this in the way Xi Jinping is running his foreign policy right now, that there's a feeling that China deserves to be a great power, that it has a right to have a greater role in the world, and to start to dictate what the rules of diplomacy and economics are in the world. And Xi Jinping, he's not a dummy. He knows his history. He talks about it all the time. If you read his speeches, I recommend, if you do so, that you have a very large pot of strong coffee with you, because it's pretty slow going. But if you do read his speeches, you'll see that he's constantly referring to Chinese history, Chinese culture. He's constantly quoting the old philosophers. He knows this stuff, and he knows, he has a sense of his and his government's position in this greater historical epic.
If I can interrupt, can you guys hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Fantastic.
Wonderful.
Okay,
Welcome.
so just no video. I'm sorry, but I'm still here. And I apologize if you covered this while I was trying to fix my audio. I just wanted to say, Michael, just briefly, the book is ambitious and it in the historical terrain that it covers. And I thought the writing was playful in a way that makes that history quite accessible to the reader.
Thank you.
It was a really enjoyable read. The main takeaway for me was this idea, and I know you've been talking a little bit about it, that China has its own history and sees the world through that history, and that the West needs to understand that perception and that history.
Right.
I just wondered if, to give you a hypothetical question, if you had the chance to give Donald Trump some advice now on how to deal with China today, what would you tell him is the most important lesson from Chinese history, or maybe the most defining moment for China, and what is the lesson that Trump can learn from that?
No. I think there's too much focus now in policy, especially in the U.S., less so in Europe, that somehow you can stop China. I don't believe in historical inevitabilities. Is China's moment to be a superpower now? We don't really know that. Is it going to take them another 200 years to maybe under a different government to recreate the old power that they had? Maybe. But the idea that somehow you can stop what's going on with a certain set of policies is the wrong way of thinking about China. This is a very ambitious government, as I was talking about, and they know their history, and they know what place they want to have in the world, and the Chinese are going to want to have that place in the world one way or the other. So I think the issue, that the thinking in Washington has to change from kind of control to how do you accommodate a rising China without sacrificing the American system and the American values behind that system, which is a different way of thinking about what's going on. For instance, I think in Washington and Europe, there's a lot of time that's been spent talking about how do we fit China into our system, right? And I don't think the Chinese see it that way. I think the Chinese see the kind of the U.S.-led world order, which of course has benefited them tremendously, but I think they see it as a foreign imposition into a world where they usually had their own world order. And you can see, Xi Jinping talks openly about having a new form of foreign relations. He's very vague on what that means. It may not mean bringing back the old imperial, tribute missions and that kind of thing, but obviously it means that China wants to have a certain. They just don't want to play in the system where they feel they have a subordinate role. They want to be a force in deciding what that system is. And that's because of the values of this government. That's potentially a danger to U.S. interests, European interests, and the interests of democracies more broadly. But that's where things are going. So I think there has to be a strategic shift in thinking into how do we deal with a China that's heading in this direction. and yet preserving as much of our system that's important to us and our values as we can.
Mm-hmm. I wondered if you might be able to make a prediction for us, which is something you touched on in the book quite a bit. So, the 20th century was in many ways shaped by American exceptionalism.
Right.
Do you think this century is going to be defined by what you describe as Chinese exceptionalism?
Exceptionalism.
And how does Chinese exceptionalism differ from U.S. exceptionalism?
Yeah, it's interesting. I've started calling the U.S.-China confrontation as a clash of exceptionalisms. When you're American, you grow up thinking that that Americans have a certain mission in the world to bring kind of liberty and freedom and democracy to the world. This idea of the city upon a hill, and that American civilization should spread around the world and change people's lives. And when you look at China, going back to very, very early stage, basically pre-imperial days, going back to Confucius and the early philosophers, the Chinese thought very much the same thing about their own civilization, that their civilization was civilization, and everything else, therefore, by definition, was not civilized. But the world wasn't totally hopeless if you're a foreigner and you're a barbarian and you accept the ways of China and accept Chinese civilization, and you can be transformed. And that word was actually used often in Chinese literature and Chinese political writing and imperial writing, that Chinese civilization could be transformative. And you can kind of see this coming out today in the propaganda that comes out of the Chinese state, especially in this post-pandemic period, when the Chinese are selling their what they see as their more successful methods of fighting the coronavirus compared to the U.S. and evidence that they have a superior modern civilization, and they're using that to market themselves, that it's China's time to basically be a world leader instead of the United States. So you can see these ideas of exceptionalism starting to kind of it goes beyond kind of an ideological war. It's a war of self-perceptions.
You write about quite a bit about China's leadership today, trying to reestablish a connection with its past. But in a lot of ways, there seems to be a contradiction there, because communism is very much about rejecting the past and sort of starting new, right? Where does the party fit into China's dynastic history?
It's an interesting question. I think it's something they're struggling with. Xi Jinping talks a lot about promoting Chinese soft power again, and they've expended quite a bit of effort on it with like the Confucius institutes and so on. But this is still a society that to a great degree is at war with its own past. As you said, communism was supposed to clean out the old society and bring in an entirely new society. And when you read the writing of the founders of the Communist Party, this is an outgrowth of the May 4th movement and so on, that they believe that basically everything had to go of Chinese traditional culture, that it was Chinese tradition that was holding China back from being modern. And during the Cultural Revolution, the Red Guards were attacking the four olds, and they were ransacking Confucian and Buddhist temples. So that's basically been communist history with its own past. Now, it's been slowly changing since the reform period in the 80s, but now under Xi Jinping more than ever, you see Xi trying to change that and connect his government and the communist government to the past, and marketing the communist government as the champion of China in the world, that they're going to restore China to the greatness that China had. That's what, what's the Chinese dream? Again, another ridiculously vague concept that comes out of Xi Jinping. But it's really about restoring Chinese influence in the world and greatness in the world. So he doesn't use this language specifically, but you can see in the messaging that he's trying to present his government as something of a successor state to the old powerful dynasties, and selling the idea that that's what China is going to have again under his government. But it's a very as you said, it's a very contradictory story. They're very selective in how they talk and about Chinese civilization and Chinese tradition. It's not like the general public in China is carrying around Confucian texts in their backpacks. So this kind of return to the past has been extremely incomplete and very conflicted. But he is trying to kind of change the narrative of what the communist messaging has been for much of the Communist Party's existence in China.
Just going off of this idea of sort of historical amnesia. So, looking at maybe some recent history that's been ignored or sort of rewritten by the party. I don't know if maybe you draw from that or further back. I wonder what lessons from China's own history are currently being ignored by the leadership that shouldn't be ignored.
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, I think Xi Jinping is somewhat misunderstanding the foundation of Chinese power on a certain level. When you look at the old style of diplomatic relations that China had with its neighbors, in the ceremonial form, it was other people's sending tribute missions to the emperor and kowtowing to the court and becoming vassals of the Son of Heaven. And that's how things were kind of written out in Chinese records. That's not really how things actually happened. This was a certain, not that they didn't have meaning, it was extremely important to the Chinese as a source of political legitimacy as well as a way of projecting their power. And in some cases, they did make a pretty unreasonable demands on their so-called vassals. But at the same time, it was a relationship kind of like in a feudal sense between lords and the people who expressed loyalty to those lords, where there was a much more kind of give and take. The emperors were willing to accommodate their so-called vassals in all kinds of ways. For instance, there's a story from the early 18th century where the Vietnamese government decided that they wanted some copper mines that were just north of their border with the Qing Empire. And they just decided to take them. So they kind of marched north and they claimed a certain patch of land. And you would think that this would have, the Qing army on the march pretty quickly. And it didn't. The emperor decided to compromise. And they reached a settlement where some of the land was left in that Vietnam wanted was actually left in Vietnam's hands, and they kind of redrew the border. When you look at what Xi Jinping does today, for example, with the South China Sea, it's almost impossible to see Xi Jinping taking that kind of action. Or you see what's going on today, for example, on the Indian border. I think what Xi doesn't seem to understand is that the way that Chinese relations worked under the emperors was much more subtle, much more complex than the lingo of the diplomatic order suggested. And I think when you see the resistance that his government is facing around the world right now, I think it would be helpful for him to go back and read a little bit more about how Chinese foreign policy actually worked under the emperors. And he may not be having as many problems as he's currently having.
Another theme in your book is the idea that China is now trying to rebuild its superiority and those pillars of power that once made it a superpower before it was interrupted. To what extent do you think decoupling, or this idea of decoupling that the US is pursuing, helps or threatens this trajectory?
It's a good question. I think to a certain extent, my issue with decoupling, just to kind of step out of history for a second. I understand the sentiment behind decoupling. I understand that maybe in certain industries and certain sectors, it makes sense from a national security standpoint to not be so reliant on a country that could ultimately become an adversary, or just not to be reliant on a foreign country of any type, certain things that are important. Having said that, decoupling isn't actually a policy. So you decouple and then what? China is still there. There seems to be this perception among the decoupling crowd that if the U.S. kind of steps back, that China somehow falls apart. That I don't know why that would be the case. It might have been the case in 1982, but it's not 1982. So I think by decoupling, you could slow and complicate China's rise, but I don't see how that could actually totally change the trajectory that China is on. In other words, I think it could hamper China's development, and for example, in terms of technology and innovation, where China is still somewhat reliant on the U.S. and Europe more than they like to admit. But I think that the decoupling is not going to change the ambition of China. It's not going to change the policies in place that are designed to make China more powerful, both as in a military force, in technology, in the global economy, and also as a cultural force as well. And so I don't see really decoupling as an answer. I think we need to have, even if that's where the U.S. heads, there needs to be, okay, well, now what? That's just part of some overall strategy in dealing with the rise of China. It's not the strategy.
Do you see a situation in which actually it might help China?
That's an interesting question. I don't really see how it helps. I mean, when you look at what's happening with decoupling, in the U.S., there's still a lot of debate over whether the U.S. should or should not decouple, and how much, and what should our relationship with China be. When you look at what China is doing, the Chinese have already pretty much decided that they see their future with a smaller role, a smaller role of the U.S. in their economy and their society. That they think they're going to have a different relationship, a less important relationship. Not necessarily, that's not the right thing. A relationship that's not as close with the U.S. going forward as it has been in the last 40 years. I mean, what what was made in China 2025, which I know the name's not around, but the policies are still there. That was basically an effort to replace foreign technology and foreign business with homegrown alternatives. So that's actually a form of decoupling. What is the Belt and Road Initiative? This is about developing new links of trade and commerce and business. That basically means having the U.S. having a smaller role in China's global commerce and business. And Xi Jinping talks openly about being self-sufficient in technology. This is decoupling. Look at what's happened to Chinese investment in the United States. It's effectively evaporated. So whatever the debate is in the U.S., the Chinese have kind of decided that they want to limit their relationship with the U.S. And I think the West more broadly. I'm not sure that helps them. I think they would have been smarter looking at it from a purely economic standpoint, to continue to have an open and closer relationship, a less confrontational relationship with the U.S. and Europe, where you could still have access to those markets and technology that China still needs is to really develop its economy and get to the next level. This is still a middle-income country, so I'm afraid that the Chinese see decoupling as important for them, but they're actually kind of making an economic mistake.
I wanted to just touch briefly on Confucius, who plays a large role in Chinese history and in the book as well, in your book. And I wanted to ask, when we look at Confucius and his concept of what it means to be Chinese and to be a leader, I wondered if you could apply that and sort of the characteristics that Confucius describes as crucial, apply it to Xi and help us understand, does Xi sort of embody, which characteristics does he embody that Confucius writes about, and where does he perhaps in any ways deviate from some of those characteristics?
I don't want to speak for Confucius, but if he was around today, I would think that he would not think that Xi Jinping is Confucian at all. Confucius had somewhat of a utopian view of the world and politics, where he believed that rulership, that good government should be based on virtue, and if you were a virtuous government, that people would follow you willingly, and you would have a transformative effect on society, that this virtue would spread and you would basically create a virtuous world. And the implication of that is that you don't need laws. A truly virtuous government would have no purpose for coercion, right? Because people think, well, that emperor is so fantastic that we're going to be loyal to him just because he's such a great guy and he runs the country so well and he treats us so well, and he's so wise and benevolent. What you see from Xi Jinping is increasing coercion. I'm sitting here in Hong Kong where you're seeing the results of that, but also on the mainland as well. So to a certain extent, I think what Confucius would say is that if Xi was really a benevolent ruler, and he quotes Confucius philosophy all the time and Confucian moral precepts quite often, but if he really was following his own comments and he was really reading Confucian thought properly, that he would have no purpose for his policies. That the policies themselves show that he's not a virtuous ruler, that he needs to coerce people. That's my guess of what. So the Confucians would say, if you know your Chinese philosophy, that Xi Jinping is a legalist. He's not a Confucian. The legalists believed in maximizing state power, and they believed that people, the masses, were basically useless and had to be controlled. And what's interesting is that if you go back all the way back in their inception, the legalists and Confucians actually had similar roots. There were some of the most important legalist thinkers actually had a Confucian academic background. But so there's actually some similarities and connections going all the way back. But they greatly diverged in this thinking about the role of the state.
I have two more questions before I know Jörg had another question, and then we'll open it up to the audience. So if people want to start thinking about and sending in some questions, but I wanted to touch on what you just said, applying the Chinese historical lens to Hong Kong, where you and I both are currently, and where we've witnessed history this week with Beijing voting through the national security law. For the national security law here. So I wonder if you can take sort of your understanding of history and using that tool to understand what what happened this week, and try to explain the decision from Beijing using history as opposed to kind of what as reporters we've all done, which is looking at recent the past year, which is a city convulsed by protests.
Yeah. Well, uh, we all know the history of the Opium War and what happened, this kind of thing, and I think what's going on in Hong Kong to a certain extent, a conflict of different historical narratives. Beijing sees the return of Hong Kong as the righting of an old wrong, of a Chinese people who were subjugated under colonial rule, who are now returning to the motherland, and therefore should basically be rushing into Beijing's open arms. And that's kind of the way that the Chinese leadership sees Hong Kong. But that's not necessarily what's happening on the ground. Whether we approve of how Hong Kong became separated from China or not, it was for a century and a half, and to a certain extent, until the national security law has still been separate. And they're an entirely different community developed here in those 150 years. There wasn't Hong Kong as we understand Hong Kong before the British. It wasn't I think Lord Palmerston called Hong Kong a barren island when the Qing dynasty first ceded it to Britain and the Treaty of Nanjing. It wasn't a barren island. There were people living here, but it certainly was not the community and the city and the metropolis and the wealthy place that it is. That developed under an entirely different historical narrative, with its own government, its own values, its own relationship with the world. That was very, very different than what was going on mainland China. You have families here with completely different historical experience, and of course, a lot of families that fled the mainland, that fled communism, that fled the disorder of the civil wars to Hong Kong to kind of find a different life. So you have this whole other history going on that Beijing acts that doesn't exist, because it doesn't fit very neatly into their own historical story. And that's part of the conflict going on, that Hong Kong has its own identity, its own community, and its own sense of self that Beijing refuses to acknowledge exists, because it doesn't fit into their historical story. And that's what's playing out this week, where you have a Beijing that's trying to impose its view of Hong Kong onto Hong Kong, and Hong Kong doesn't like it very much.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Jörg, did you want to jump in? I see you said you had a question. Oh, you're still muted.
Yeah. I hate this stuff. Michael, thank you very much. First of all, being 30 years in China still, I can't figure out a couple of things. Actually, you addressed them in your book very well. The two things when it comes to history you constantly hear in China is 5,000 years of civilization and 200 years of humiliation. But if you look into the narrow sense of, in particular, the last 800 years, at least to me, it looks like 400 out of these 800 years, China was ruled by foreigners.
Yes.
I mean, of course, Mongols and the Manchus, different language, different terms, different political system. Han actually were discriminated. But it seems like it doesn't exist. It's just 200 years of humiliation from areas that definitely was humiliating, in particular the heroin. But also to me interesting is to see that when these Mongols went down, China, or the Han liberated themselves as well as the Manchus. China grabbed the lands of the Mongols and grabbed the land of the Manchus, in a way expanded its borders tremendously, but still has the sense of it's not an aggressor, because it actually never attacked anybody. It just sort of grabbed the loser's land. Is this something that we should pay attention to, that China doesn't see itself as aggressor, but it's perceived now, particularly from abroad, that it has very aggressive demeanor?
Yeah. It's an interesting question. Yeah, I mean, it's you're right that, the way the Chinese kind of see themselves as a superpower doesn't actually necessarily fit what actually happened. The reason why I think the last 200 years have been especially jarring to the Chinese, and that's where my book talks about the interruption. Is because I feel that it was a time when China lost all sources of power. I mean, even when the Mongols invaded and they controlled all of China for almost a century, the Chinese could tell themselves, well, we're still a superior civilization. Look at how those Mongols, they didn't totally absorb themselves into the Chinese world, but the Chinese didn't adopt the ways of the Mongols. The Mongols adopted the way of the Chinese, and the Manchus even more so. I mean, a couple of the Manchu emperors are considered some of the greatest emperors in Chinese history. But that didn't happen with the West. With the West, they came into a confrontation, really for the first time, with a civilization, a totally different civilization, that thought that it was superior and that the Chinese were the barbarians. And this basically started what we were talking about earlier, where the Chinese basically were at war with their own history and their own culture. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, Chinese reformers basically decided that if they wanted China to be modern and they wanted China to survive, that this traditional culture that had been the foundation really of Chinese power basically had to go. So I think the last 200 years were special, and also the West also rewrote the whole Chinese world. All those supposed vassals that used to send tribute over to China, now they have defense treaties with the United States. The entire East Asia, the lines of the bonds were completely broken and redrawn. And I think this is why one reason why the Chinese find the last 200 years to be so especially jarring. But getting to your other question is I mean, I'm sure a lot of people on listening have had the same experience, where they get into conversations, or you see on social media Chinese saying, "Oh, China's always been a peaceful power. We've never invaded anybody. We don't have wars with people." Actually, if you read Chinese history, they've basically been at war with more or less everybody you can think of. I mean, name somebody that's been in East Asia, and they've been at war with them. In some cases, it's China was not the aggressor, like with the Mongols. In some cases, China was most certainly the aggressor, like with Tibet. But the Chinese have basically sanitized their own history and their view of history. And I think you see this to a certain extent playing out in the way the Chinese see what's going on today. When one thing I think that's frustrating about China's modern foreign affairs is that they definitely don't take responsibility for their actions, but they certainly don't seem to see the consequences of their actions. And they seem honestly befuddled as to why the world sees them as being scary and aggressive. And I think, part of this is Chinese government propaganda. Part of it is this completely erroneous self-perception that the Chinese have always been a peaceful superpower and will continue to be a peaceful superpower.
I want to jump in there, Michael, just because you brought that up. Very recently, we're starting to see and hear from emboldened Chinese diplomats who've embraced a bit more of an aggressive sort of quote-unquote wolf warrior approach to foreign affairs. So I'm curious, is it a break from China's historical past in terms of the image that they've conveyed overseas? And if it is a break, is this a reflection of China being influenced from the outside rather than from within?
No. That's a really interesting question, which I'm going to have a little trouble answering. I mean, when you look back at the old imperial rhetoric, it was pretty bombastic stuff. About, it's interesting, for example, reading some of the imperial edicts surrounding, for example, the treasure fleets of Zheng He in the early 15th century. And how they felt that this was a mission to transform other societies, and how other societies welcomed Chinese, the the civilization and wisdom of the Son of Heaven. It's pretty over the top stuff, and you'll see this from all the dynasties and the way that they presented themselves. In that way, you can kind of see it as, a continuation. At the same time, the world has changed, I think at least China's neighbors in the past, understood the nature of Chinese diplomatic rhetoric and what it actually meant, and kind of understood it within the context that it was meant, and understood it in the kind of the diplomatic language at the time. That's kind of not what's happening today. The world is a different place, and I don't really, to be honest with you, I'm having trouble understanding what the Chinese think that they're achieving exactly by this very aggressive diplomatic rhetoric. Are they trying to win over people's opinions? Are they trying to convince people that they have a just cause? Are they trying to browbeat people into silence? Are they just venting with no strategic purpose? Do they not realize that it's having somewhat of a detrimental effect? I don't know if they're thinking about this, and obviously in the context of their own history, but a lot of bombastic nonsense coming out of what's effectively the imperial court isn't necessarily a big surprise.
So I think at this point, in order to open up to the audience, I'm passing on to Jacob, who is going to read out some of the questions.
Thanks.
Are we unmuted? Perfect.
Oh.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right, so our first question comes from Li and Zhong. Should be kind of a quick and easy one to answer, but should clear it up. So thank you for the opportunity and for bringing this to our attention. May I ask, what does superpower interrupted mean exactly? So the meaning of the title.
The meaning of the title? The meaning of the title is that China, for much of its history, was a superpower and actually perceived itself as a superpower. Until this horrible interruption happened about 200 years ago with the confrontation with the West, when you really had all the pillars of Chinese power eroded, and China had this very jarring experience in this experience with the West. But it's also meant to convey that this is just an interruption in this greater historical narrative. It's not that what happened in China in the last 150 to 200 years is not an end of itself, but it's just it's part of this greater story stretching back for 2,500 years, 3,000 years, and trying to put what's happening today into that greater context.
Great, thank you. Our next question comes from Johnny Broes, who is the vice chair of our environmental working group. Throughout Chinese history, China has kind of vacillated between periods of being very international and open, followed by much longer periods of closure. So thinking about, the Tang Dynasty or the Ming Dynasty.
Right.
Is it possible that we're heading towards closure again? And does that explain the current kind of foreign and domestic politics?
Yeah, that's a really interesting question because, as you said, I think like any society, honestly, the pendulum swings between periods of great openness and periods of isolation or xenophobia. China has had that. I think what's really interesting is that the periods of Chinese history that are considered to be the most vibrant and glittering tend to be periods when society was relatively open. Especially as you mentioned, the Tang Dynasty, which is kind of seen as the height of Chinese civilization, was also the period of China's greatest openness to the world and to foreigners and to foreign ideas. So you could almost equate a Tang Dynasty period with the early reform period when China came out of this extreme isolation and started to open up to the world and open up to foreign business and foreign education and foreign economists and foreign policies and all this stuff, and obviously because of what we see in China today, had a tremendously positive experience from that connection with the world. I think you're right. I think you're very perceptive in feeling that the pendulum might be swinging back, and you're seeing a greater nationalism, greater in economic policy, a greater focus on self-sufficiency, a much more wary attitude about its relations with the world, much more wary of foreign influence within China, I unfortunately, it feels like the current leadership hasn't seen the connection that Deng Xiaoping did, and he said this openly, that he blamed China's problems on its closed door attitude. But I think this current leadership has unfortunately broken from that thinking, and they feel the need to limit foreign influence as a way of taking China to the next level. And I'm not very convinced that that's actually the right way to go.
Great. All right. For our next question, sorry, let me pull it up.
Go ahead.
So we see a fair amount of kind of historical revisionism being used to sort of suit the CCP narrative. So domestically, you have the classic example of, Qin Shi Huang was bad, but he unified the country and ended the warring states period. So it kind of excuses whatever happened, and that there's sort of a revisionism that this is the standard historiography throughout all of Chinese history, when in fact it's quite the opposite. The Confucian scholars didn't take too kindly to their books being burned and then being buried. Do you think there's any similar revisionism going on now, specifically to push a narrative abroad? So not so much for domestic audiences, but for what China's relationship with the world is like, and what would that sort of revisionism mean for China and for the world?
I would actually think that the rewriting of history that this current government likes to do is actually much more aimed at a domestic audience than a foreign audience, where the Chinese government likes to create a narrative that of basically victimization, and how that is the driving force for what this ambition that China has to restore its power. And I find it interesting how often you see events that happened a very long time ago, the Opium War or the Boxer Rebellion or something like this, come up in Chinese media on such a regular basis, because the party continues to pound home this idea that their relationship with the West has been such a horrific experience. I wish they would look at the other part of this narrative, which is how tremendously successful China has been in due to its partnership with the West in the last 40 years. That China wouldn't be China as it is today without the cooperation of the United States and Europe and their allies. And that never seems to be enter into the propaganda that I can ever see. I mean, there's this it's barely ever even mentioned. I mean, this government likes to pretend that the outside world was not important in China's rise, and I think this is basically a domestic. This is a rewriting of history meant to give legitimacy to the current government and build support for the current government by basically creating a conflict with the outside world and focusing on a certain narrative of the history of the last 200 years, of a narrative that it's choosing to focus on. I don't know that answers your question, but for me, this is a very dangerous narrative. I think Chinese foreign policy would look very different today if it focused on what the tremendous benefits that China had gained from its partnership with the United States, rather than focusing on the Opium War of 150 years ago. I don't see how that serves China's purpose right now and where China wants to go. But this government obviously sees its history differently.
Great. All right, we have a couple different questions from Claudia Gutierrez and Richard Kropath in regards to sort of the reaction that we're seeing from Xi Jinping specifically, but also several other officials, sort of the reaction to the international reaction of China's behavior. And specifically, they're asking, do you expect that there's going to be much of a rethink coming from Xi Jinping in response to these sort of reactions? And also, specifically, Richard wants to know your comment, if you could comment on Jiang Xiaoming's statement. He's the executive director of the Hong Kong and Macau Affairs Office. And he said to Washington's retaliatory sanctions, quote, "Of course we're not afraid. The era when the Chinese cared what others thought and looked up to others in the past, or is in the past, never to return."
To a certain extent, one question answers the other question. I mean, this government seems to be completely deaf to the reaction of the world to its policies and doesn't take any responsibility. And I think that last comment kind of explains a certain part of it. There's a lot of anger in the Chinese government that focuses on this history of being basically what they feel to be subordinate to the West, humiliated by the West. And now it's their time to kind of rise again and be on top. And this just fits into this greater historical narrative going back 2,500, 3,000 years, where the Chinese believed that they always had a rightful place to be on top of the world and everybody should be looking up to them, rather than the other way around, as it has been in their perception for the last couple hundred years. So, this is a leadership that's feels that it needs to correct the wrongs of history. I mean, to give you an idea about how old this kind of thinking is, there's a famous memorial from the Han Dynasty from the 2nd century BC. So this is the first decades of the Han Dynasty. And the Han Dynasty was in a conflict with the Xiongnu Confederation, a kind of a northern steppe confederation that was very militarily powerful. And the first Han emperor got into tried to start a war with the Xiongnu and reclaim some territory, and almost didn't escape with his life. So after that, the Han court decided that they couldn't defeat the Xiongnu on the battlefield. So they signed a settlement that was kind of a cash for peace deal, where the Han would ship incredible amounts of money and silk and all the stuff to the Xiongnu, and the Xiongnu promised to keep the peace. It was basically the Han emperor paying tribute to the Xiongnu, though it was not called tribute, but that's effectively what it was. And it actually was somewhat successful in keeping things stable. But from an ideological standpoint, the Han Dynasty didn't like this at all. There's this famous memorial written by a Chinese statesman at the time to the court, in which he described the situation as being like a person hanging upside down. That the emperor was supposed to be on top, and these Xiongnu barbarians were supposed to be vassals. And here you had a situation where that was effectively reversed, and it was basically an intolerable situation. And at great cost, the Han Dynasty, Emperor Wu of the Han Dynasty, decided to toss out this settlement and go to war. It was a war that the Han Dynasty eventually won, but at tremendous cost. And you can see this resonating in the attitude of the Chinese today. I don't know if they've read this memorial or not, obviously, but it's a similar kind of thinking that in the last 200 years, the world was upside down. And now they're trying to set things right side up. Are they doing it in the way that will be successful? It's looking more and more that all they're doing is basically increasing the opposition to their efforts at turning the world right side up. And it seems Xi Jinping there's no signs of him softening his policies if anything, he seems to be to becoming more aggressive on just about every front you can think of. And let's look at what's happened in the last few weeks, not just on Hong Kong. Look at what's happening with India, with Canada, and the two Canadians effectively being held hostage. You name a foreign policy issue, and the Chinese are tripling down on their stand. And this is to a certain extent because they see the world needs to be turned right side up again.
Excellent. All right, our next question, we have 2 more questions. If anyone else has further questions, please submit them into the Q&A tab at the bottom of the Zoom window. Our next question comes from Yen Mas. What role do you see for historians working on China's history? And I'd add to that, what sort of difference might exist for Chinese historians working in China as compared to foreign China historians?
Well, I think China does itself a great disservice by not having academic freedom. So, I mean, the problem that if you're a scholar in China today, you're going to be expected to write within the narrative that the Communist Party wants to promote. This is not good for Chinese policymaking and the education of the Chinese people. So I think, and you're already seeing a lot of it. There's already been much of a divergence between what overseas Chinese scholars write about China and focus about China and what you're seeing being written inside China. I don't. Maybe this is an ideological standpoint. Personally, and being an American and believing in the free flow of information, but I don't see how the leadership of China can guide the country in the right direction when you're not allowing a free discussion of where the country has been.
Good. All right, our next question. In the kind of in the middle of the Qing Dynasty, there was the rather infamous Mccartney Mission, which failed to get a trade deal with the Qianlong Emperor, who said, something along the lines of, the Celestial Empire has everything in abundance, and you have nothing that we need.
Right.
Do you think there's a similar attitude growing not so much to foreign trade, but towards foreign investment these days? And are there any lessons that Europe can learn from what you've studied and what you've put into this book as the EU and China continue to negotiate an investment deal?
Yeah. It's interesting. There was this idea about trade that was mainly in the later imperial dynasties, that trade was a gift from the emperor to the barbarians. They believed that, for example, the Europeans simply could not survive without the bounty of China. That it was a matter of life and death for the Europeans and Americans, and that the emperor was granting them access to the riches of China out of his amazing benevolence. So that, and you can, to a certain extent, see vestiges of this today, where the Chinese government seems to believe that foreign companies and foreigners and foreign nations should be trading and investing with China only on Chinese terms. This is different than some of the older dynasties like the Song were much more open with trade. But this does, when you look at the attitude of the Chinese government today towards foreign companies, how different is it than, the old Canton system? And you can see, the conflicts of the Mccartney Mission almost still playing out today, where you have a bunch of Westerners, banging on the door for more access and not getting it. But and even more, going back to something we were talking about earlier, that the Made in 2025, Made in China 2025 program and these other industrial policies are really have a bit of an autarkic feel to them. This government feels that everything China needs, China should have of its own. There needs to be a Chinese version of everything. That they cannot rely on foreign trade. So I think with Europeans, and I'm going to sound very, very American here, so I will apologize to all the Europeans listening in. I think the Americans have caught on to this a little bit more quickly than Europe and the dangers of it. I actually don't mean the EU Chamber of Commerce. The EU Chamber of Commerce has been ahead of the Americans in describing the dangers of Chinese industrial policy to European companies and European industry. I don't think this message has quite been digested by the leadership of the EU and individual European economies, where I don't think they fully understand the threat that this thinking in China presents to European business. That however whatever treaties you try to negotiate, or however nice you are to the Chinese, they are still going to try to develop their own EV companies. They are still going to try to replace the chips that you make with Chinese chips. And that pattern that line of policy is not going to change. And that has to become a factor in the way that all foreign countries doing business with China have to start thinking about their relationships with China on an economic basis.
All right, our next question is sort of looking at this conflict between China and the quote unquote West, and from the perspective of the developing world, or kind of third countries in general. So how well can we understand the perspective from these third countries, and are there any sort of historical anecdotes or lessons that sort of play into that?
I'm not sure I'm following that question exactly. I'll take a stab at it. Historically, when you look at China's relations with its neighbors, to a great degree, China set, let's say, the rules of the game. China set the terms of diplomacy. China set trade policy, and then everybody else basically had to play by these rules. If you wanted to have diplomatic and trade relations with the Chinese, you had to kind of play by Chinese rules. And these rules are incredibly powerful because between the other societies themselves, they often use Chinese rules with each other. So relations, for example, between Korea and Japan had similar aspects to what Korean relations were with China, for instance. But of course, these rules and these bonds were kind of completely destroyed with the rise of the West, and now relations, work entirely differently. And I think if I'm sitting as one of China's neighbors right now, I'm wondering, is China again trying to set the rules of the game in Asia, and what are those rules going to be? When you look at how China deals, for example, with Korea on the issue of the South China Sea, the way it deals with the way it's dealing with India right now, you start to get the feeling that maybe officially they don't want to see tribute missions coming to Beijing, but that they're trying to assert their rules onto everybody else in a way that China historically has. So if I'm sitting in Seoul, or I'm in Hanoi, or I'm in Delhi, or Bangkok, or I have to decide what this means for me, and do I want to play by these rules? Can I play by them? What does this mean for my relationship with the U.S. and Europe? It's a very muddled picture right now in these. I mean, I don't think these countries want to make this choice, and unfortunately, it looks like the Chinese are going to increasingly press them into making these types of choices.
All right, and our last question coming from Chris Dix, and maybe this is also a good question for Alex. Does decoupling with the U.S. also mean decoupling with Europe and the West in general, or is there a key role that Europe can play?
Well, okay, I'll start it, and Alex probably has thoughts on this as well. There's a challenge here because I think what we've noticed under the Trump administration is that the big mistake in regard to China policy of the Trump administration is thinking that the U.S. has the power on its own to contain and control China. That is not the case. China just goes ahead and does business and works with everybody else. And I think if the Washington and its allies are going to try to get a kind of to pressure China to change some of its practices, they're going to have to stand together in a much more united way than they have been, and not just in a rhetorical sense, but in a real sense, which means that I think the Europeans have to think a lot more about what they want their economic relationship with China to be going forward, and how that fits in with where the U.S. relationship is going. The West is not going to be successful in pressuring China if the Chinese, okay, well, we can't get that technology from the U.S., but we can get it from Germany or France. Then there's no pressure on China, and that's what you're seeing happening right now in the Trump administration. That the Chinese have been able to basically divide the West and play the Western powers off each other, and become more and more assertive, and therefore kind of weaken the West's response. Why are the Chinese moving on Hong Kong right now? It's because they're pretty sure that the Western allies are so divided that they can't get together on any kind of coordinated action. So I think the Europeans are mistaken here in thinking that they can somehow have a completely different policy from the U.S. And still, if they want to, still find a way of controlling or containing rising Chinese authoritarianism and what that means for their European national interests.
Oh, sorry, Alex, you're muted.
Just to jump in there, I would argue the counterpoint, although I suspect that most of the members who are listening in would be much better placed to answer this. But from my own reporting in recent weeks, it seems as though the skepticism that we've seen for a few years now from the U.S. side and the hawkish view is starting to emerge in Europe.
That's true.
And I think we're seeing it if you look at the UK and you look at HSBC in particular has become quite the lightning rod for British politicians to kind of question and start to hold China to account. So I don't know. I think maybe things might be changing, but
yeah.
But listen, Michael, this has been a fascinating discussion. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you to the Chamber for hosting, and hopefully more and more people will read your book and be able to use the lens of Chinese history as a tool for understanding better what is happening today and as China defines the future for us all.
Thanks a lot. Thanks, Alex, for taking the time to do this. Yorick for organizing it, and everybody at the Chamber for their help in this. Really great. Thanks for the great questions. Made me think about some new stuff, so I appreciate it.
Yes, thank you very much, Michael. I hope that was a good teaser for people to buy your book online or in hard. and hope that I see you back in Beijing eventually.
Thank you.
That is really overdue. And second, of course, Alex, I really wish you good luck in your upcoming joint venture. Next days to come, one of my sons is born in Hong Kong. He's the most vibrant of all my 5 children. And so I think he just picked up the Hong Kong vibe that I hope will also continue after the second handover, as we witnessed this week. So good luck to you, Alex. I'm really looking forward to the good news. And to all of you, you can see the next lineup. We have something on the 16th. It's Michael Pettis' book that just came out, Trade Wars Are Class Wars, and Martin Wolf actually reviewed it in the Financial Times. And Martin immediately said yes when I asked him if you would sort of be the moderator for this upcoming book of Michael Pettis. So ladies and gentlemen, members, dear Michael and definitely Alex, all of you have a good time and enjoy your weekend. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.